So hopefully this works. There we go. So thanks everyone for coming. We're going to be talking about accessibility again, super simple accessibility this time. If you came to one of my previous talks on this subject, this is going to be slightly different in that I'm going to be looking a bit more at code, a bit more at the most common problems that can occur and demonstrating how easy they are to resolve with just some really simple HTML and a little bit of CSS. And the thing I wanted to highlight was that HTML and the web in general is actually really accessible by default. It's got lots of features built in that make it accessible, and it's only when we don't use those features or we do stupid stuff like put a plant pot in the middle of a wheelchair ramp here that things start to go wrong. So these are the 4 or 5 things I'm hoping to cover in the next 20 minutes if there's time. So starting with semantics and talking about the importance of having a really strong foundation of HTML to build on top of. And then looking at keyboard and focus, image, alt text, colour, and finally some form stuff and some validation stuff to finish. So starting with semantics, and I wanted to remind everyone that it's still really important to validate our HTML. Even though browsers are pretty consistent at rendering dodgy HTML these days, they're pretty good at interpreting what we were getting at. It's still important for assistive technologies that we have really accurate HTML so that they understand how to communicate that page to their users. And it's really quick to do. So if you validate the HX homepage in a moment, you'll see something a bit like this. This is just the top. I think the list is much longer than this in reality. Most of these are missing attributes. We've got a 4 attribute on a link, which doesn't make any sense, things like that. Really, really strange stuff. If you feel like fixing any things like these in ChipApp, on SEO pages, in any repo, please do. That would be awesome, because they do make a difference and it makes debugging much easier later on as well. Probably the most important and most useful semantic structure in HTML is the headings. So H1 to H6. If you look at any accessibility survey over the past few years, this always comes top of the things that people find most useful, and also the area that tends to have problems in it that cause difficulties for people. And they need to be hierarchical. And what that means is something like this. So we'll have one H1 that describes the content of the page, exactly one, no more, no less. And then within that, if the page has any subsections, we'll have H2s that describe those subsections. And then subsections within those will be H3s and so on down to H6. This is good for SEO, of course. It's also good for accessibility because some people use this information to navigate. So where many of us can look at a page and we can see quite clearly the structure of the hierarchy of the page thanks to the typography. So some headings will be bigger than others. We can see the hierarchy that way and through the white space. Lots of people can't use this information, so we need to provide it programmatically through our headings. So assistive technologies like screen readers, this is VoiceOver, have a way of surfacing all the headings on the page and presenting it in a list like a table of contents or a menu. So this is one of our landing pages. It's not too bad, although you can see at the top there's a bit of a strange thing going on. We've got an H1 and then we jump to an H3 and then we go back to H2s. So we've broken the logical hierarchy there, I'm not sure why. If anyone fancies fixing this, that would be awesome. So please keep an eye on headings and make sure that the structure makes sense because they're really useful. The same sort of thing is provided in other screen readers like JAWS here. And also on mobile devices, there's a mode you can switch into that lets people jump from heading to heading if they're marked up correctly using simple gestures like swiping. There will be cases where you want a heading to look like a heading of a different level. So you might want an H2 to look like an H1 because you want the big text and you want the bold weighting and things like that. The incorrect thing to do here would be to change the heading to a different level, so to actually make this H2 and H1. That would obviously impact SEO, it would be wrong, it would change the hierarchy. So the correct way of doing this is to add a class. So I've got an H1 class on my H2 element. So I'm applying the look and feel of a particular level, but I'm not affecting the semantics or the logical structure of my headings. And while we're on the topic of that list of headings that you can get to, something similar is available for links. And it's important that we write links, therefore, that make sense when they're removed from their original context. So here's a really terrible example, not from our site, thankfully. This is a links list, which is the same sort of thing as that headings list we looked at before. And this has sucked up all the links on the page and it's presenting them to me in a list that I can use as a menu or as a table of contents. But whoever's written these links has just used the click here phrase for all of them. So we've got no way of knowing where these links go to, what they do, what their purpose is, because they're removed from their original context. So it's important that we write these links in a way that makes sense. So here's a real world example from the HX brand guidelines, in fact. So we originally had this paragraph of text at the top, It says Pattern Library has detailed guidance for using fonts on the web here, and then here is a link to that documentation. Again, that doesn't make sense when you remove here from the sentence. So this was refactored to say Pattern Library has detailed guidance for using fonts on the web. And using fonts on the web makes sense in that sentence, but it also makes sense when you find it on its own in isolation. So keep an eye on the wording of links. If you see any click here's, more information, things like that, please change them to something that makes sense. Landmarks kind of build on headings. They're another semantic structure that we can use to mark out regions of a page that people can jump to from the keyboard. It looks something like this. This is a contrived example, really simple example of a web page with 3 landmark regions. There's a navigation region at the top there, which is just a normal unordered list wrapped in a nav element. Then there's a main content region. You should have one of those on every page, exactly one, no more, no less. And then there's another nav region at the bottom there. What's the difference between the 2 nav regions? The one at the top has an ARIA label attribute on it, and that's just providing a friendly description of that landmark. It says products, so that's the products navigation component. And the one at the bottom does it slightly differently in that it's got an ARIA described by attribute pointing to the heading that exists. So that's saying this navigation is described by this heading that's already there. So they're doing the same job in a slightly different way. Naming landmarks like this is really important because much like the link problem we saw before, if you don't name the regions, you'll just get a load of regions that have the same name, so navigation in this case. You've got no idea what all these navigation regions are. It's not useful at all. Counter to that, the example on the right in this slide is from BBC, and they've named all of their regions in a way that is clear what the purpose of them is, so you can find what you're looking for and jump straight to it. So please use landmarks, but please name them. It makes a massive difference. Moving on to keyboard then. And keyboard is more important than people realise, I think, because it's not just blind people using a screen reader, but it's also people using devices that emulate keyboards in one way or another. So a Braille display emulates a keyboard, and they also use a keyboard at the same time. But other devices emulate keyboards, so people with reduced mobility will use switches of one type or another, which might look like this. Different people will have different arrangements and numbers of switches that they'll operate, sometimes with their hands, but they might just operate them with their head or with their feet or knees. And these switches emulate a keyboard functionality to move you through the page and to input content as well. This is a sip and puff device, so this is doing the same sort of thing as a switch, but using sips and puffs to navigate through a page. Again, that's emulating a keyboard. It only works if your website is built with keyboard accessibility in mind. And voice commands, this is from Apple. This is their new interface for voice commands. This numbers all the interactive parts of a page, so then you can just say tap 6 and it will do that for you. Again, that relies on this being built for keyboard accessibility. This is an app, but the same thing applies to a website. So keyboard accessibility is really important, and it's actually really easy to test as well. To catch most of the issues, you can just tab through the page. And when you're doing that, you're looking for 3 things broadly. Firstly, that everything that's interactive can receive focus. So buttons, links, form controls, sliders, date pickers is a good one. You need to be able to get to by tabbing to them. While you're tabbing, you need to make sure that your focus is visible at all times. So when you're tabbing, there should be no point when the focus just disappears and you can't see where you are on the page. You should always have a focus ring or some sort of treatment around it. And thirdly, make sure focus is never trapped. So if you can tab onto something, you need to be able to tab away from it. This happens sometimes if you've got some dodgy JavaScript with an event handler that's listening for key presses but not discriminating between what key it is. It will stop the tab key working, so you can get to it but you can't get away from it. And the only way to escape is to refresh the page, which is super annoying. So they're the main things you're looking for with tabbing and with keyboard accessibility. Another really common problem is, on our sites in particular, is anchors without href attributes. So normally an anchor has an href that points to the destination of that link. Sometimes we remove that href and we handle the click with JavaScript for one reason or another, which is what's happening here. This is an anchor, there's no href on it. This is from, I think, our homepage or landing page going to lounges. This will never receive keyboard focus at the moment, so it's not usable with a keyboard. To fix this, we would just put an href attribute back on this. It can be empty, it just needs to be there, and then that anchor will receive keyboard focus again, and it can be used. Native controls is a good one. So you could take a div or a span And you could give it rounded corners and a shadow and make it purple. And you could even have JavaScript to make it do a thing when you click it, but it won't really be a button. It won't have the role of a button, it won't have the states of a button or the properties of a button or the native accessibility of a button. So just use a button in most cases instead of trying to build your own component. And that applies to form control, special sliders, things like that. Just try and use the native one and style it because it's built with accessibility in mind from the beginning. And it just works out the box. Image alt text, 2 rules that I want you to bear in mind. If an image provides information, it needs to have a text alternative that gives you the same information. Example from our site here on a parking page, I believe. There's this image towards the bottom here. It says, as featured in The Telegraph, Money Saving Expert and The Independent. That's one skinny image along the page there. And the alt text on this at the moment is holiday extras featured in. So you don't get the list of publications that were featured in. This makes no sense to anyone who can't see the image at all. The clear example or the clear solution for this is to reword that. So it's holiday extras featured in The Telegraph, Money Saving Expert and The Independent. So keep an eye out for alt text that doesn't provide a complete alternative for the image. Excuse me. The other rule to bear in mind, which is sort of the opposite of this, is that if an image is just decorative or it doesn't provide any more information that's already available, it should have an empty alt attribute so that it can be ignored. So here's one I found. This is interesting. We've, for some reason, got a Holiday Extras logo tag on the page here. You're on the Holiday Extras website, and we talk about Holiday Extras here. So I can only assume that this is just for decorative purposes. It's not really serving a purpose or providing information. So I would make that so it can be ignored by assistive technology. At the moment, it says Holiday Extras logo on the alt text. So that's what you would hear if you're using a screen reader. It's just noise. It's not doing anything. It's not adding any value. So you would think the solution is to remove the alt attribute like that and just have an image tag. The problem with doing this is that it's not valid to begin with, so your validation earlier would have caught this. But assistive technology will often fall back to announcing the file name instead. So you would probably hear bucket spade2.png, which is just, again, just noise you don't want. So the correct technique for hiding an image is to have an empty alt attribute, no space, just a null alt attribute. And that's a signal to AT that you should not include this in the accessibility tree, just ignore it completely as if it's not there. Incidentally, this other image on the page has a mixture of information that's repeated in text, like the purple parking, but it has information that's not available in text, like the approved operator. So we need to add an alt text or an alt attribute for the information that's included in the image only. Jumping onto colour. Colour is a great way of providing information. It's a nice visual way of providing information, but we can't rely on it as the only way of providing that information. So a football match, I don't know who these teams are, I'm afraid. A red team and a green team. So you can see at a glance which team is which player belongs to which team, unless you're blind and then you can't see at all, so you lose that information completely. Or if you're colourblind and you've got the most common form of colour blindness, which is red-green colour blindness, everyone is a kind of mustard colour. So immediately you've lost that information about who's on what team because you don't have access to the colour information. This applies on the web. This is Apple's range of phones here and the choice of colours available. And they've remembered that they need to provide a text alternative, so they've included the names of the colours along the bottom there. So even if you can't see the images or you can't perceive the colour, you know which is which and you can make your choice. On our sites, our links are blue, which is awesome because it's really contrasted against the white and it contrasts with the black text as well. But we've underlined our links so that we're not just relying on the colour, which is great. You can see that's a link, that's the thing I can click because it's underlined. With the exception on this page, over on the right there in the basket, the product name is also a link, it's blue, but we've removed the underline. So the only way you can tell is through the colour. So that is a problem that we've introduced and you'll see those cropping in here and there. So if you see those, challenge them and fix them. The other colour thing to remember is contrast, contrast against the background. So the minimum requirement is 4.5 to 1, which doesn't really mean anything. You can't tell by looking at it. You have to use a tool to measure it. There are loads of these. If you Google, you'll find lots of different ones. Just find one you like and use it. This is the one I tend to recommend from WebAIM. It tests 3 things at once. So it looks at the contrast of the link to the body text, so the purple to the black in this case, the link to the background and the body text to the background, and it gives you a pass or fail result for each of those. And finally, I wanted to look at forms, labels and errors. This is slightly more complicated, but only slightly. And the first rule is to explicitly associate labels with the inputs. An example at the top here probably looks fine at first glance. We've got a label immediately before an input. The label describes the input, says first name, and there's a text input. The problem with this is that if you're using a screen reader or a braille display, you will move from field to field without going through the label. So you won't hear a label field, label field, label field. You'll just go through the fields. You won't hear the labels. There's no way for the screen reader to pair up or to know which label describes which input, so they won't be announced. So we have to programmatically pair the two things together, which is what I've done at the bottom. It's the same with the exception of two attributes. So I've added a for attribute on the label and an ID on the input, and the for points to the ID of the input. So we're explicitly saying this label describes this input. So now when that input receives focus, the screen reader can announce the label. Braille display can pair the two things together. And this also increases the clickable area for mouse users, which is an added bonus. And that's also a quick way to test if you click on a label. If it doesn't give focus to the field, you know they're not paired together properly. You will occasionally want to have one label that describes a group of fields and not have lots of labels for each one. So first name and last name in this case, you might want first name, last name field, but one full name label above it. You still need to provide the two labels for each of the fields for assistive technology, but you can hide them in a way that's not visually apparent. So I've added a class to the two labels here of SR only, screen reader only, so that hides it visually but keeps it in the DOM, so it's still announced by screen readers in the normal way. And then we've got one label above that's visually available to everyone else that describes the group, a full name. It's a nice simple solution for that problem. Mandatory fields. The normal way to indicate these is with an asterisk. It's not particularly pretty, but it's well understood. If you're using a screen reader, you will hear something like first name asterisk, first name star. Those users will know what that means typically because they're used to hearing it. But we can do better. It's not particularly nice. So the one at the bottom, I've improved slightly. I put a span around the asterisk, and I've given that an area hidden attribute. And what that's saying is that I don't want the content in this span to be given to the accessibility tree, to be passed to the accessibility API. I want it to just be ignored. So it will stay on screen for everyone else, stays in the DOM, but it's not announced by assistive technology. And then on the input, I've added an area required attribute. So I'm programmatically saying this field is required. So then assistive technology can announce that in whatever way they want. They can say required, mandatory, or they can play a sound effect. I think JAWS, you can set to play a tone for mandatory fields. And then finally, I think the last thing we need to do for forms is to alert users when something's gone wrong. So there are loads of ways to do this. This is just one nice way that I've picked out to demonstrate. So if you imagine at the top here we've got a div. This would appear at the bottom of the form after all the fields, after you've submitted, and this would contain a list of all the errors that are in the form that you need to know about. This div has an ID of error, and it has an area live attribute and a role of alert. And that area live attribute is telling assistive technology, please watch this field or this element for changes, and whenever it changes, please announce that to your users so they know. And the assertive value of that is saying, please interrupt whatever else is going on to tell them straight away, don't wait for a gap. So whenever an error appears in this box, screen readers will announce it to their user so they know straight away. There's a tiny bit of CSS at the bottom here. All that's doing is hiding that div when there are no errors, so when it's empty it won't appear. And the final piece of the puzzle for this is to identify the fields themselves that have a problem. So in addition to making them red, adding a border as we normally do on those invalid fields, I'm doing some stuff to announce that programmatically. So on the input, I've got an area invalid attribute saying this is an invalid field, it's currently invalid. So that will be announced by screen readers as saying this field is invalid, please fix it. And then I've got an area described by attribute that points to a paragraph of text below. And that's just a spot for me to explain what the error is and how to fix it. So by adding these two attributes combined with the label, when someone comes to this field, they will hear the label of first name, they will hear that it's invalid, or they'll have a tone that they're used to hearing to say that it's invalid. And they will also hear straight away a description about how to fix it, what the problem is. So it's a really nice, neat solution, just using a few attributes that are built in. So those were the 5 areas I wanted to cover. It's very quick, I know. So if you want to learn more about these in more detail, 2 books I wanted to recommend. Inclusive Design Patterns by Hayden Pickering, which is more focused on the code side of things in HTML. And Accessibility for Everyone by Laura Kalbag is more holistically looking at accessibility, the wider picture. I think they're both in the library. Laura's one certainly is, if you want to borrow that. If not, just order them. And if you want something a bit more interactive and practical, I'm going to recommend this course again. And this is Google's Web Accessibility Fundamentals, which is put together by engineers for engineers. Thank you. For engineers by engineers, it's pitched at an advanced level, so it assumes you know HTML, some JavaScript and stuff like that. Covers all the stuff I just did in far more detail and lots of other things. It's a 2-week course, but it's self-paced, so you can do it at lunchtimes or project lounges. That is everything. Thank you. I'll answer your questions if you have any.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions. We're looking at really trying to improve the accessibility for our emails, and one of the things, so the ARIA hidden attribute, is that able to be put on any HTML element, and then that will be ignored?
Yeah, so the question is, can ARIA hidden be used on any element, particularly in emails?
Yeah.
Yes, it can, and I think support's pretty good. Maybe not as good as web, but it should be pretty good. It should still work, yeah.
And another one as well is, you talked about VoiceOver, using VoiceOver. Is that a pretty good standardization for what screen readers are like? If we wanted to test how accessible our emails were for screen readers, would you recommend just using VoiceOver?
Yeah, so is VoiceOver a good example of a screen reader to use for testing? It's the one I always recommend because everyone's got it on a Mac,
Yeah.
and it's pretty widely used. It's a really good screen reader. JAWS is the most widely used. I think it's about 60% or something, but that JAWS costs £800 for a license, I think. That's the one people tend to do if they can afford it, but lots of Mac users use VoiceOver because VoiceOver is really good and it's built in. So yeah, it's a pretty good representation of what you would hear.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
I was just going to ask, is there anything that you could tell our engineers, for example, if they could do something different day to day, or if there's something they could bear in mind in order to improve accessibility on our website? Is there anything like top tip or something that they can remember when they're coding to do?
So is there a top tip for engineers to bear in mind for accessibility? I think our biggest problem on HX stuff at the moment is keyboard accessibility. So like we've got lots of links, as I said, that don't have href attributes on them, so you can't get to them on a keyboard. I think Crush has already volunteered to fix those, which is awesome. But if you see any of those, just stick an href attribute on it. Just an empty href attribute will fix it straight away in most cases, so just do that. And then we've got problems with things like date pickers that are completely not usable by a keyboard, so I'd like to revisit that. Keyboard, yeah. Ollie.
On the subject of keyboard navigation, say for example you're on one of our availability pages where there's like 40 plus tiles.
Yeah.
Would the preference in behaviour be that someone literally tabs through every link on every tile, info, photos, blah blah, reviews, skip. Next one is the Copthorne, info, reviews, blah 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 blah, next tile. Or would like a better behaviour be to be able to tab through the tiles, whereby you change the voiceover by actually saying this is the Copthorne,
Yeah.
offer reviews, so on and so on.
Yeah, so in theory, I haven't looked at our markup recently, but I think that's a list. Is that an unordered list or something?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I can repeat that. Is that what you're hiding up? So is there a way that we can improve keyboard navigation in availability in particular, where there are lots of tiles? Is it a good experience for people to be tabbing through all the links and things? There is a lot of repetition there. I think we mark up our products as an unordered list, hopefully, in which case, Stu's nodding, in which case you would know straight away that how many products there are, which is useful information. I think each one has a heading, like an H2 or something. So again, you've got keyboard shortcuts that let you jump from heading to heading, so you probably do it that way.
Is that a screen reader?
Yes, yeah. So I think in most cases, as long as you write markup sensibly, people have got those shortcuts anyway, so they can just jump around as they need to. Did you?
I'm currently working on your documentation for forms in Pattern Library. Can you add all these examples to that, please?
Can I add all the examples to Pattern Library?
Yes.
Yes.
Or at least there's a bunch of them where, as you know, in our documentation we don't necessarily have coded examples just purely because of the labour involved in doing that. But there's clearly some obvious things that are worth the investment,
Yeah.
and we should continue to
Agree. So some of this is documented in the culture repo, if that's still a thing. There's a page of accessibility tips in that. I think we need to migrate that into Pattern Library or somewhere else that people can get to. I'm just going to stand here until someone comes.